Snow is reeling with the fact that he dropped a handkerchief of Lucy's scent into the snake's cage, and he's trying to figure out, did I do it because I care about her, or did I do it because I want to win the Hunger Games? And the version that is easier for him to swallow is that I want to win the Hunger Games, because he can't quite admit that he has feelings for a district girl, because that prejudice is still so ingrained in him. However, it's also because he thinks his life is on the line, not literally like hers. However, he needs to win the Hunger Games so then he can get this, full ride into university, because he thinks if he gets into university, anything after that will be easy, that he can fix all their problems and be able to support his family. So the imagery and the use of snakes have shown up so many times throughout this book that it's becoming like a motif, and it's even in the title of the book, so obviously it's important. I think it has to evolve around the connotations of snakes within folklore and mythology, and the most common example will be within the Bible, case in point with the snake convincing Eve to eat the apples. And when you look up, snakes supposed to symbolize, at least in the Bible, temptation, death, deceit. So I think if you look at it that angle, this makes every time a snake appear interesting. I think because Snow is spiraling with all his recent decisions and his honor, he goes to visit Shannis, and it's not to make sure Shannis is okay. No, it's to make himself feel better, because he's a conceited, arrogant asshole, and he had come to be thanked because he thinks he deserves to be thanked. He should be thanked because he's a Snow and he's classier than them. So being in that house, he finds reasons why he's better than them, even though he has no money and they have all of it. I like Shannis' father trying to dissect Snow, because he's saying that Snow reminds him of Snow's father, but also of Snow's mother, where he definitely inherited his father's prejudices against the districts. However, he masks it with his mother's courteousness and appearing. So some people like Shannis might interpret him being genuinely kind, whereas I think Shannis' father is saying that, yeah, I don't think so. I think if there was a choice, you wouldn't have saved my son. I still hate how all the mentors are taking all the credit for the tributes, especially after they die. Because this one right here is saying, I wish she could have come out sooner so I could have fed her, but I feel like I could hold my head up. The final 8 is nothing to sneeze at. Dr. Gall comes on to announce that one of the Capitol kids died due to complications from the bombing, and then she says, but actions speak louder than words, and our rebel enemies seem somewhat hard of hearing. In response, we planned something special for their children in the arena, and that reminded me instantly of something said in Catching Fire by Snow when he's announcing the Quarter Quells. He says, on the 25th anniversary, as a reminder to the rebels that their children were dying because of their choice to initiate violence. Every district was made to hold an election vote on the tribute who would represent it. It's the two of them saying that because of your actions, we're gonna punish your kids. No thinks something interesting when he thinks Dr. Gall does not breed lapdogs. She designs weapons. And on one note, it's fascinating because she's not using her mind and her skills to improve the lives of the society and its citizens. No, she is prolonging the war by creating the weapons. And it reminds me a little bit about Beatty. However, he does want to improve the lives of his citizens, and he's most known for creating stuff that do improve the lives. However, because of the circumstances, he is forced to use his skill to create weapons, which then goes into the whole argument with Dr. Gall, Gale, and Beatty. Just because you can create the weapon, should you create the weapon? Same with the atomic bomb. Just because we can create it, should we create it? Okay, I'm really excited, but also very nervous to see how they're gonna do this imagery of Lucy Gray kneeling in the ground and all these rainbow mutant snakes coming and blending in with the rainbow ruffles of her dress. I want to see it, but I'm afraid it's gonna be so bad. Okay, so my mind just hit and went like calls to like. That's what popped in my brain. And I'm wondering if it's these rainbow snakes are drawn to Lucy because they were similar in a way that both of them don't quite belong in nature or is the same as the rest of things around them, and they have this secret poisonous part of them. I don't know, I'm just rambling. The lyrics to Lucy Gray's song right now is beautiful because it's basically, in my opinion, her saying that, yeah, I will come to death when I'm ready, when I have crossed every T's and dotted every I's, and I am not ready to die right now. Also, the whole symbolism and mirroring of the scene to the original trilogy, because Dr. Gall created this mutated animal in hopes of using it to her advantage, in hopes of it being a weapon, yet Lucy destroyed that. Just like how the Capitol created the Jabberjays, but then they weren't, then they were being manipulated by the districts and no longer useful, which then they mutated into the Mockingjays, forever mocking the Capitals at their attempts of playing God. And then Snow says, when hit, we hit back twice as hard, quoting Dr. Gall, but it also feels very reminiscent to something that Gale would have said in Mockingjay. I can't remember his exact line, but in the end, it's an eye for an eye and the whole world goes blind. When does this end? Okay, so I finally took the time to look up Clemencia because I knew obviously I had to relate to something with Greek or Roman mythology based off all the other names. I probably could look up all the other names, but I'm not going to right now. But Clemencia is, I believe, supposed to be Clementia, a Roman goddess who is the goddess of clemency, forgiveness, mercy, which is interesting because of her actions right now, but also Snow feeling like he's trying to avoid gaining the forgiveness for leaving her behind, kind of like thing like that. It's interesting that Snow continuously brings up that Persephone's family were possibly cannibals during the war based off what him and his cousin saw her father doing, but continuously interacts with her and treats her as a friend as much as he treats anyone as a friend. But yet he is condoning the districts and everyone else's actions for the lawlessness of what they were doing, especially during the war and like now, and like, you know, what the districts are barbaric, but he doesn't condone her, and that's because she's capital. It's also interesting that Snow is looking around at the remaining mentors, seeing them as his, you know, competitors, acting like they have any control over what is going to happen in the arena. So because Snow likes to tell us exactly what he eats and all the food, because food is such a big part of this entire series, it's interesting the infrequency that they feed the students. Like, so today there's no breakfast provided, but then they'll get like a boring lunch with like lunch or stew, which reminded him too much of the war, but then they'll also get a steak dinner. So like the type of food that they get and the infrequency of it, it's interesting. I love Reaper, not only because of his symbolic role as a Grim Reaper, but also the way he's interacting with the food, because Clemencia finally sends him food, but he ignores it because he doesn't trust the capital. He probably assumed it's the capital that put rat poison in the food that killed that one tribute. So it's fascinating. With one of the tributes hijacking the drone and changing it to then become a weapon is fascinating, because the drones, one, symbolized food to these tributes up to this point, but she also took a capital technology and changed it for her benefit, which is fascinating. It's fascinating because up to this point, predominantly, only the pack were out hunting the other tributes. Most of them were just sitting there watching one another weirdly. They didn't interact, even if they were out in the open and vulnerable, especially with Reaper, but that might be because he's supposed to symbolize the Grim Reaper and death, and they want to keep their distance from him. But like, all of a sudden, the Tech tribute kills the District 4 tribute, and as she's celebrating, the District 7 one kills her. And is it because she did it because the District 4 was part of the Cure Pact and was hunting, and she's like, well, he's a killer, so I'm going to kill him. And then the District 7's like, well, she just killed him, so I'm going to kill her. Is it a chain reaction? Like, what? And then once again, Lucy Gray is mocking the capital and Dr. Grawl by using the snake as a weapon against one of the other tributes, using it for her own benefit. Also, she is very clever and obviously been watching Reaper and realizes that he doesn't trust the food and water, but he's trusting this puddle. And so while he's sleeping, she alters the water by filling it with her water bottle, which probably has rat poison in it, and dumping it back in the puddle, so then when he drinks it next, he'll be poisoned. And then Snow imagines that what if Lucy wins and they can be together, but in his imagination he only imagines it with her in the capital. Obviously he gets to keep his home because, you know, he's able to pay the tax money, and he thinks, and he wanted to keep her safe and close at hand, admired and admiring, devoted and entirely unequivocally his. But it's he wanted to keep her. He's obsessed with her. He's not in love with her. Snow then comments how he didn't even see how Lucy removed the snake to attack Treach, which is almost like a magician, like a magic trick, kind of like what Lucky was doing on camera, because Panem et circuses, bread and circuses. Reaper's death is such a fascinating scene because he is slowly dying and he is aware of it, especially after drinking from the poisoned puddle. And he drags his body because he can no longer move it, the heat stroke in the poisoned puddle, drags it over and lines himself up with the rest of the dead tributes, and instead of covering Treach's body, he covers his own with the flag. Suzanne Collins once again gives us an amazing high. We are at the highest of high, and then immediately hits us with a low, because part 2 ends with Lucy and Snow winning. Yes, they are lumping Snow within the win, even though he did do a little bit more work than the mentors in helping her win. However, he's thinking that life is at a high, everything is like going well for him, but then immediately it ends with him being called in front of the dean, where on the table lays out all the incriminating items showing that he had cheated. And that's all we get basically from that, and just hinting, saying that the meeting lasted no more than 5 minutes. By the end of it, he is sent to the recruitment center to become a peacekeeper, which is a punishment for the districts. And it's done when, like, you do something wrong, you are sent to be a peacekeeper to go die off in obscurity. Before I get started in part 3, I just want to quickly talk about the ending of part 2 because I ran out of time in my last video, but I love that those final moments, the ones where like he learns that they know that he cheated and now he's enlisting to be a peacekeeper, happens within 2 very short paragraphs. And I think it's brilliantly done because probably in that moment, your whole world is crumbling apart, your mind goes blank, you blink, and all of a sudden you're being forced to be sent to the districts to go die off in obscurity. Like, I think it's just brilliantly done. That probably is what his mind was thinking like in that moment. We continue to see that Snow views the district as other, like they're a completely different country or even a different species, like they're an alien planet within like the second paragraph of like part 3. And it's him like noting like, oh, look how ugly it is. It's not like him and the capital couldn't influence and change them to be just like them. Like they are purposely, willfully making them be other, their enemies, someone to continuously hate, someone to be the monster. It's interesting that the dean is describing Snow's mother having been vapid and childlike because it's very similar to how Katniss describes the capital citizens. However, eventually Katniss says that it's not their fault because they were childlike, all the things that happened, whereas unfortunately, I'm going to have to side with Gale. We think that they're using it as a form of defense, that they're using the childlikeness as a mask so they can participate in like a bystander effect where they can ignore willfully the crimes that are happening. So if it ever comes back to haunt them, they can be like, I wasn't involved. I didn't have anything to do. Snow confronts the dean going, why do you hate me? I thought you liked my father. I thought you were friends. The dean says, I thought I was too, once, but it turned out I was only someone he liked because he could use them, even now, which is paralleling how Snow uses Shanus. It's an exactly same relationship. It's fascinating to me that Snow's grandmother says to him, remember, Coriolanus, that wherever you go, you will always be a Snow. No one can ever take that from you, because it made me instantly think of Peeta up on the roof thinking, will I still die as myself? Or will I become a capital mutation? Will he still be Peeta Malark, or will he just become another faceless pawn used by the capital that died in the games? For one brief moment, which I know is going to shatter in the next second, he kind of is relating to Shanus' mother, because previously he had criticized her for clinging to these random items in her kitchen and mementos from her previous life, but yet he is doing the same. He's putting them as random items in a box because he is forced to leave his home now. Miss Suzanne Collins, I love this mirroring right here because Snow is on the cusp the night before his life completely changes. There's no going back from what is about to happen. And him and his cousin sit up on the rooftop overlooking the city, just like how Peeta and Katniss did the night before the games. I love this brief glimpse that Suzanne Collins is giving us to this dystopian version of North America, because he does actually say back to when this had been North America, not Panem, it must have been fine, a land full of capitals, such a waste, because he's looking at all these abandoned cities falling apart, and like we didn't get a glimpse of that really in the original trilogy, so it's interesting to see like there's still remnants of like our society, but they've already decayed, so it's been a long enough time. Shanus and Peeta are superior to every other character in their respective series. Are they perfect? No, because they're still humans. They still make mistakes and have flaws. However, they are like the personifications of the potential goodness and humanity. They are the morality. And I love, though, that they are not perfect because it presents that humans have the capability of being good too, but still will make, still struggle and make mistakes. Once again, we're seeing a very similar relationship Snow has with Shanus as he does with Lucy in this moment, at least. Because he's very excited to see Shanus, but I think it's because he does not mind that Shanus is seeing his downfall, because Shanus is below him automatically, because no matter what, he will always be a district, kid to Snow. In this moment, Snow's learning that he partially got away with things, that he still got his diploma, and like the dean got outvoted because the rest of the board are romantics and think that he fell in love. Like, it's not his fault that he fell in love. And like, he's seen that how easily people believe in this romantic notion, even if it's not completely there, even if they only got like minuscule glimpses of it, and how it could be manipulated to benefit him. Which all this then goes into how Snow later is at least distrustful of Katniss and Peeta, thinking that they're manipulating the system for their benefit, and more so thinks that Katniss is the ringleader, because Lucy, we later learns that find out it kind of manipulated him for her benefit. He doesn't realize that Peeta's the ringleader. However, we also can kind of see that I think Snow is imposing himself and Lucy's story onto Katniss and Peeta because they look similar. Like, Katniss and Lucy have similar coloring, and even though Peeta doesn't have the white hair, he still has the blonde, like a fair curly hair similar to Snow, so it's very easy to look at them and imagine himself and Lucy. Snow is telling Shanus how he thinks Dr. Gall views the Hunger Games, and that she views it, the Hunger Games are a reminder of what monsters we are and how we need the Capitol to keep us from chaos. But it's also a reflection of how Snow views the games and how he thinks that humans can't be trusted to make their own decisions, to have freedom and liberty, because then we turn into monsters. We need totalitarianism, you know what I'm saying. Once again, we're seeing that Snow is not in love with Lucy. He is obsessed with her. She is a possession of his, because he described it as his girl, his love, his Lucy Gray. Thank God for Shanus to be there to pop some of the Capitol lies to Snow, because Snow's like, we pour so much money into the districts. It must be true. People always complain about it in the Capitol. And Shanus says, no, we pour money into our industries, not the districts themselves. The people are on their own. I love that Snow is getting his first true glimpse at a real forest, and it terrifies him. It is chaos. It is something he has no control over. He has no idea what is in there, you know, what creatures could be there. And it's so different from how Katniss views it, because she sees it as freedom, as sustenance, as something where she does not feel the oppression of society and the government pressing down on her. Okay, it's looking like there is not a fence separating the forest from District 12 yet, so I wonder if Snow put it in because it terrifies him. He doesn't even like having his back to the flora and fauna. That scares him more than, say, having his back to the District 12 people. It's just fascinating. And at the very end of this chapter, we're getting the glimpse of inspiration to Lucy Gray's song, The Hanging Tree, which is, we all know from The Hunger Games, the song that Katniss sings. We're seeing Snow's instant hatred towards Mockingjays. I don't even think he's fully aware of why, but it's the taking of a capital weapon, a capital technology, and leaving it off to die because it backfired on them. But however, nature took over, and we already see that he hates nature because he cannot control nature. And the Jabberjays mated with Mockingbirds, forming the Mockingjays, a continual mocking of the Capitol's attempts at playing God. And also, though, I'm curious of how did it become a pin to then be given to Katniss? Was it done accidentally, or was it done on purpose to mock Snow? Also, I love that Snow does not see the irony of the situation, because he is kind of similar to a Mockingjay, because he was sent off by the Capitol to go die, no longer necessary, no longer needed, but yet returns different, returns changed and more powerful. Snow notices Shanus being more reserved, reacting a little odd, and he's like, what's wrong? And Shanus says, I didn't think this through. I think Shanus went out hoping to once again become a district citizen and maybe just help protect them, keep them safe, not realizing that he is an extension of the Capitol and their oppressive powers. He is still a Capitol's pawn. Snow got a letter from Pluribus Bell, and in it he's saying that why he thinks possibly the Dean and Snow's father had a falling out, and in it he said that like Highbottom was angry, saying he had been drunk and the whole thing was meant to be a joke. And so we can make an assumption that he was jokingly put forth the idea of the Hunger Games, but Snow's father took it and probably went to Dr. Gall and made it into reality, and then gave the credit back to Highbottom, making it his legacy. Like this thing that he drunkenly threw out into the universe, not thinking it would matter. It would just be words tossed to the wind, but now he is stuck with this legacy. Wait, I just had this realization. So Dean Highbottom threw the idea of the Hunger Game out into the world, just like thinking it would be words lost in the wind. But Snow's father picked it up and repeats it and continues it on. Just like a Jabberjay and the Mockingjay. You throw words out into the wind thinking they'd be lost, but they repeat it back at you, just like the final words of the Hangman. And in both scenarios, it's showing that your words have weight, that you can't just throw things out there and think it would disappear, that it will continue to haunt you and be used against you, that it is heard and used. Lucy Gray, throughout this entire book up to the ending, is a great mystery. And I think in part it has to do because even though it's third person, it's limited to Snow's thoughts and feelings. So I think that's what makes her more ambiguous. But in this moment, you could look at the way that she reacts seeing that Snow is there in District 12 and being excited that maybe she does like him, or you could view it as her being surprised and then going, you know what, he as a peacekeeper could be beneficial to me because he still has some form of power here in District 12. I also would like to know that when I read this the first time in 2020, I think I read this with more of a capital view because I believe that there was a love between Lucy and Snow. I thought that they were in love. Was it perfect? No. Was it a little toxic? Yes. But I thought that maybe they were in love and I thought it was cute. But now that I'm reading it, I'm seeing a lot more tones of manipulation and obsession than love. I don't think there's a true love between the two of them. When a brawl begins to brew in the hub and then the lights go out, there's a fight that happens, Snow gets punched in the face, and he's only concerned about keeping his own personal circle of safety. He doesn't care about anyone else, not Lucy, not Seamus, not anyone but himself, hinting at his not only selfishness, but then he thinks about Dr. Gall, saying that's mankind in its natural state, the humanity undressed. He views humanity at its worst. It's fascinating that Snow notes that the miners fight back only when the lights go out in the hall, but they didn't during the hanging, and I think it's because they know that they're outnumbered and outgunned. It's stupid to go face to face with the Capitol in the broad daylight. You gotta wait for dark. You gotta wait for that opportune moment when they have their back turned and they are not expecting, and it's to show kind of what they're gonna become when the rebellion happens in the original trilogy. We're seeing that the prejudices that Snow had previously but was being like swayed from slowly now come back in full force. Now he has real life examples as to why he should stand by these prejudices and these biases against the districts. And you know, he's quoting Dr. Gala and his grandmother, but as he walks in the dark, I think they're escorting the mayor's daughter. He's not alone, but a fight just happened. He's somewhere unknown. They're in the dark, and he's assuming this is what noble life looks like in the districts. It's violent, it's scary, it's dark, and he's longing for the safety of the base because, of course, the base is a surrogate of the capital. So we're watching this slow beginning of the avalanche of his prejudice, the reinforcing, the digging deeper into his hole. We are also getting a glimpse at seeing why the Hunger Games aren't resonating the way that, you know, Dr. Gall wants, is in part because places like District 12, either places don't have a TV at all, or the TV that they do have aren't really getting much of a reception. So then we now know, obviously, with the trilogy, the original trilogy, that it is mandatory and it's like the only good channel that they get that everyone has to watch. And if you don't have a TV, you go in the square, like you have to watch it. To continue with my previous video, I think it makes it easier for the districts to ignore this punishment because they only have to experience it one day, pretty much on reaping day, and even then they're not seeing these kids die, so they can ignore it and move on with their lives and pretend like it's not happening. Whereas in the original trilogy, we see it evolves where they have to watch it. They have to watch, you know, live with the potential of not only their kids being taken, but then watch these kids die year in and year out and be told by the Capitol it's your fault. What an interesting tidbit of information that I completely forgot about until I'm reading in this moment. Dean Highbottom gave Lucy money. He did it, but was kind of on the quiet. First, he apologized for what I'd been through. Then he stuffed a wad of cash into my pocket. And I think it will lead to how the victors of the games get money and get to live a life of luxury afterwards. But I think Dean Highbottom does it to appease his guilt at least a little bit for the legacy that has been thrust upon him. Snow is so possessive, so egocentric, and just like, oh god, toxic, because he says this one line while the sight of Billy Top in what he now considered his territory annoyed him, and his territory is Lucy Gray's house. So really? When I first read this book back in 2020, I did think Snow and Lucy were in love. It just turned more toxic by the end. However, in this one, I'm definitely seeing it a little bit more jaded. I am seeing Lucy as being a little bit more manipulative. Now, in part, Lucy is very ambiguous as a character, and that has to do with the fact that it's in third person, limited to Snow's thoughts and feelings. So we don't know really anything about Lucy besides what Snow is telling us about Lucy. However, we're also seeing Billy Top call her out, being like, you're manipulating the others to hate me, to push me away. And it makes me and even Snow think, like, is she manipulating others? That's what his grandmother thinks, that she manipulates others to her benefit. Even when Billy Top says, what are you gonna do, stick your peacekeepers on me? And she says, yeah, maybe if I have to. So it's potential that she could, or it's potential that she's only doing this because she feels like she's backed in a corner. She's just using whatever resources she has to her, you know, available to her. Oh my god. So, like, we're learning, or at least hinting from Lucy, that part of the reason why her and Billy are fighting is because he thinks that they're living by different rules, that he can do something, but what if she does it too and makes her trash? And she's basically hinting that the things that she has done was to make sure Maude Ivory didn't starve. And even Snow connects that it's very similar to what Tigress did to make sure he didn't starve, hinting that she had to sell herself, potentially. And I think this is the first crack in his relationship with Lucy, because we saw how he felt about Tigress selling herself. And so I think he also sees Lucy as this virginal, perfect little girl for him to save. And now that she's tainted in his eyes, he's looking now for more cracks. Getting another glimpse at Snow's ignorance, because the Coveys talk about, oh, we went up north beyond the capital, and he's like, what are they talking about? The capital controls the known world. Like, he doesn't know anything besides what the capital has force-fed him. It doesn't know anything of the outside world. And to continue off my previous video, his first thought of the people that could potentially live outside the capital's domain, living in animal fur, existing in caves, barely humans. So basically, if you are not part of the capital, you're not sophisticated, you are savages. I love this argument going on between Snow and Shanus, because Snow is saying, God damn it, I thought you promised to stop being like a rebel and be involved in this. And Shanus is like, no, you promised me if I left the arena, I could help the districts. And Snow's like, yes, I thought, like, you know, to help the tributes and make it more humane conditions. And Shanus is like, humane conditions, we're still forcing them to murder each other. Basically saying, you can dress this up as nice as you want to make yourselves feel better, but at the end of the day, we're still making them murder each other. It's interesting that Snow doesn't note the lack of food that the Coveys have. Like, Lily Maud Aubrey says, is there more? I'm still hungry. While Snow gets more than enough food at the base. So obviously District 12 is getting more than enough food, but it's being directed straight to the Peacekeepers, but probably to Snow he thinks, well, obviously, because, you know, we're capital and we're Peacekeepers and we deserve the food. When Snow thinks, the thing was he didn't believe Shanus would ever really change. In regards to the rebellion and districts, it's giving us this really great glimpse at his view of humanity, because based off that, it looks like he doesn't think people are capable of changing, and that's why he thinks that the district should be continuously punished instead of rehabilitated. He thinks that they will always be barbarians. We're also getting this great glimpse at Snow's later views about government, which is total control. He is snooping through Shanus's stuff, looking for evidence, even though he has no cause to search his stuff to support that he's helping rebels. In the previous chapter, Snow talked about how he's not motivated by love or ambition, but just to have a comfortable enough job, basically to reach the status his family had prior to the war, the comfortability, but I think he's deluding himself. And I didn't talk about this in the last video because I thought about it when I was trying to fall asleep last night. I think the version of Snow that we've been interacting with would not be happy having someone above him telling what to do. No, the version we've been seeing needs total control in every environment, every action, even the people in his life. Because to him, he thinks that the only way to ensure his safety and his standing and his comfortability is if he has the control, the power. And so he would be continuously seeking a higher power and control to make sure that he doesn't lose that safety. We're getting a perfect example of Snow being controlling, especially of other people, because right now he's saying he felt trapped here in base while she could freely roam the night. In some ways, it had been better to have her locked up in the capital where he had always had a general idea of what she was doing. I like that Billy Taupe is basically like the rock shattering Snow's perception of Shanus and Lucy. Because he saw Shanus interacting with Billy, now he thinks that Shanus is a rebel and is looking for reasons to support this theory. But he also doesn't trust Lucy, because you see it when he says, for all he knew, Billy Taupe was trying to worm his way back into her heart at this very moment, not trusting Lucy. Okay, that was interesting. Snow reacted to the Jabberjays like a little uncomfortable. Like, it's weird to hear the exact replica of your voice. However, he had a stronger reaction to the Mockingjays. He reacted by saying, we should kill them all. They're unnatural. But yet you're okay with the Jabberjays, which were purely man-made, not the bird that came out of basically evolution. And I think it's because the Mockingjays symbolize a lack of control, that it can very easily fall out of your hands and turn into something else. And once again, Snow needs total control. I love the deeper meaning of this sentence. So like Bug and Snow are taking care of the Jabberjays that they caught and like tagging them, and Bug says they'd be happier if we just left them in the woods. And if you look at it on a deeper meaning, he could also be talking about the districts. Like the districts would be happier if we just left them on their own, if the capital wasn't basically sitting on top of them controlling everything. And then when Lucy and Snow are talking about how he's been capturing Jabberjays and she's a little sad by it, she says, sounds like torture, having someone controlling your voice like that. And it made me instantly think of what Snow does in the future, like basically controlling the victors' voices. They can only say what he approves of them saying. Think of PETA and Mockingjay. Wait, the song that Maud is singing that she dedicated to Snow is, I think, foreshadowing Lucy's ending, because in this song it's about a Lucy Gray and how she goes out in a snowstorm and gets lost, and her parents go looking for her and they think that she fell in a ravine, but then they find footprints, but they don't know what happened to her. They think that maybe she vanished in thin air, which is basically what happens in the ending. Like Snow is chasing after her, thinks that she falls in a ravine, but has she? And the song ends with, and sings a solitary song that whistles in the wind, basically like how Lucy's songs get caught by the mockingjay, mocking Snow at the very end. Ugh. Now I'm wondering if Snow thought that Katniss was potentially a descendant of Lucy Gray, because I think he was indifferent to her in the beginning, but after, and like he probably felt like, oh, her coloring looks similar to Lucy, but so do a lot of District 12. But I think after she sang her song and the Mockingjays picked it up after Rue died, I think maybe that was the start of him going, is this Lucy Gray's descendant? Does she live? Or is this Lucy reincarnated coming to haunt me? The thing that is interesting is that Snow doesn't cut Shanus from his life, especially when it seems like being associated with Shanus is bringing him down too. But he continuously to be worried and tries to pull Shanus out of this hole that he's digging himself. I love that once again we're seeing Snow's uncomfortableness with the woods, his fear of the woods. As he's hiking through it with the Cubbies to go to the lakes, he's getting more and more afraid that he's looking and fearing. He doesn't know what creatures lurk in. He doesn't know. It's chaos. He doesn't have control, and it's the unknown. And we're getting a very interesting interaction, at least the way he thinks about Maud, because I think in part it has to do with that Snow never truly had a childhood himself. Thanks to the war, he kind of had to age up. So he is looking down on Maud when, like, she gets tired and Shanus, you know, begins to carry her and goes, oh, great, the precedent was set. Now we all had to carry her. And then she starts singing, and then the Mockingjays sing back, and we know how he feels about the Mockingjays. And he goes, oh, what a racket. Okay, now I'm really thinking that Katniss is Snow's telltale heart, that he is seeing her as Lucy, especially because Maud is describing that she thinks Lucy Gray from the song that she sang is a bird. And we also know that, you know, Katniss, thanks to Cinna, is made into the Mockingjay, and that's the bird he hates the most. Like, I think she's his telltale heart. You know what? I'm wondering if Snow was the one to put the fence around District 12, because to him, the forest equates to Lucy. That was Lucy's second home. She literally says that. But it also means that he has better control over the people, that you're herding them in, you're keeping them confined. I wonder if Lucy Gray is supposed to be similar to, like, Native American and Indigenous people stories. I'm not familiar with a lot of them, but I've heard some, and the ones I've heard, usually they have a very interesting interaction and relationship with animals, like how Lucy does with snakes, as Maud describes it. And in their stories, typically the animals are inhabited by souls of those who have passed already, or they at least respect it. I'm not completely positive. I may be wrong, but just food for thought. So I think Snow already was beginning to think Katniss was similar enough to Lucy that it scared him when she sang and the Mockingjays picked it up after Rue died. However, he begins to monitor her, and we know that in Catching Fire and catches that her and Gale share a kiss, and Gale looks enough like Billy Taupe. And so to Snow, he's probably thinking, Katniss is just like Lucy, using Peeta just like how Lucy used me. It's interesting that Snow is getting very frustrated with Lucy and now Shanus, both within the same chapter, saying that they trust him. And I wonder if it's because he at least is aware enough that he doesn't trust people. He just sees people as things to use to benefit himself. Snow tries to claim that he just acted on instinct when he pressed record on the Jabberjay, when he realized that Shanus is about to confess something, just like how he just instinctively dropped Lucy's handkerchief into the snake cage. However, I think he is lying to himself and to us. He has enough wherewithal to have done it with purpose, because he has been purposely seeking evidence against Shanus. So in the previous chapter, Bug says, why can't we just let the Mockingjays and Jabberjays exist in the woods, like live off by themselves? Why do we have to get involved as the capital? And we're seeing that play out here with, like, knowing what's going to happen in the future, that Snow won't just let Shanus run off in the woods, and like maybe he might die in the woods, never be a problem in your life or bring you back down. Why can't you just let him do that? Why do you need to be involved and have to monitor him? And that's why he has Shanus arrested. Also, we're seeing that Snow doesn't trust humanity on the greater level. Like with Shanus, he needs to know exactly where he is to monitor him, and he said a similar thing about Lucy, and that's why he liked Lucy in the capital. And he does the same thing when he rules Panem. He confines everyone in a small little box so he can watch them, because he doesn't trust them to act on their own. But that oppression just builds up until eventually it becomes, you know, something worse and explodes. Shanus says that if I stay here, I'm going to do something more drastic. I cannot wait to watch this scene in the movie, because I can already just imagine, like, hearing the song in the background and getting, like, the tenseness of, like, him looking for Shanus and seeing him talking to Billy Taupe in the corner. Oh, I totally forgot about this Mayfair scene. But, like, the brilliance of this chapter is that we were watching his anxiety build. I'm feeling anxious. And, like, him slowly feeling like he's losing control, which he needs. And like, with the whole thing with Seamus and the whole thing with like Lucy maybe leaning towards Billy, the whole thing with his apartment, his family name, and it's just building and building. And then Mayfair comes, and if she leaves, she could rat on him and he can lose everything else. So he shoots her. Unfortunately, Spruce's actions when Billy says that if I swing, Lucy's swinging with me, he shoots Billy, confirms Snow's opinion about humanity, but it also is very reminiscent about the arena, and both the arena and Snow's opinion about humanity is focused on that you can only trust yourself and that everyone else is only acting for themselves and you can't trust them, and that you should just cut loose ends and just use people and keep them at their distance. Remember earlier in the book when one of his classmates says it's okay if it's in self-defense, and basically what they're doing with the arena is a grand act of self-defense? Well, Snow says it again here. He goes, well, Bobbins was obviously self-defense, so what was Mayfair? Murder? No, it wasn't premeditated. It was obviously self-defense, but it wasn't. And in like basically one brief line, we get a beautiful example of both Seamus and Snow's mentality, where Seamus is afraid that innocent is going to get blamed for the murders, whereas Snow thinks, good, then our troubles are over. I have such mixed feelings because I like that this chapter opens with Snow capturing incriminating evidence about Seamus, and it ends with Seamus being arrested thanks to that incriminating evidence, kind of creating like a mini story arc where like all these other things happen in between those two moments. However, I don't like that Seamus is going to be hanged. Like, I'm going to start crying because he's such a good person. Also, it's not fair. Seamus has done nothing. He got arrested and he's going to be hanged for something he has not done yet. But Snow actually murdered the mayor's daughter and he's not going to get arrested or anything. No. It's interesting that Snow feels, I don't know how to describe it, not uncomfortable, but like hesitant, because Seamus and Lil look like two innocent children being dragged to the gallows, but yet he has no reservations about dragging other innocent children into the arena. I'm like tearing up, but like to continue off what Snow said about them looking like two innocent children, Seamus' final word is Ma. It's like a child terrified calling for their mother. They're still children. Even now, we still get this like little glimmer of hope that maybe Snow can still change, that he's feeling guilty. He doesn't quite say it, but you can read between the lines and see that he feels a little bit guilty about what happened, but yet then he tries to justify himself with him saying he had killed Shane as surely as he had bludgeoned him to death like Bobbin or gunned him down like Mayfair. He killed the person who considered him his brother, but even as the violence of the act threatened to drown him, a tiny voice kept asking, what choice did you have? What choice? No choice. A couple chapters ago, Snow talked about how he thinks that Seamus is incapable of change, and I think that goes into Snow's belief that he sees humanity at its worst. He thinks that they're incapable of changing, and that's why the district should be continuously punished instead of rehabilitated, because he doesn't think they can change. And we're seeing it again here, because he talks about how, yeah, he pulled Seamus out of the arena for a couple more weeks of life, and a second chance, an opportunity to mend his ways, but he couldn't, didn't care to. It is interesting to see Snow break down and mourn Seamus' death, that we're seeing that there was, even if Snow is trying to deny it, a form of attachment, a love even between the two of them, like familiar love. And yeah, I think because of the Capitol's indoctrination on him, he would have inevitably turned over that evidence. It was too strong. He would have thought that he was doing the greater good of Panem. No, I want to like you. God, I want to be so sympathetic. But then when you're called into the commander's office about like Seamus, he goes, what's worth denying? Yeah, we were close. We were like brothers. But then when he finds out that Seamus was hung because Dr. Gall got the Jabberjay message and is praising him for making that hard choice, Snow doesn't feel guilty, even though it is basically said in black and white, you're the reason why Seamus was hung. No, he says Coriolanus was beginning to enjoy himself a bit, thinking he got away with all this. He's in the clear. In my opinion, what makes the best villains in books and movies are the ones that truly believe they were doing the right thing. And we see it here with Snow saying, not a monster who cheated or betrayed his friends, but someone who had really tried to be noble in impossible circumstances, someone who had risked everything to save her in the game, someone who risked it all again to save her from Mayfair, the hero of her life. But yet, if you look at his actions and not the things behind it, they don't seem great. The most interesting thing is that he thinks that he wants to run away with Lucy and that they'll be happily ever after. However, even if they did go through with it, because I know what happens later, he would become bitter after so long. He would not be happy living in the wilderness, especially because he's afraid of the wilderness. And he would be yearning to go back to the capital, to go back to that life of luxury. Okay, the brilliant thing about the Hanging Tree song is the amount of layers and meanings it owns. It could be talking about Arlo and Lil's story. It could be talking about her and Billy. It could be talking about her and Snow and telling him, oh, we're going to meet in the meadow, meet me by the hanging tree. We're going to run away. And it could be talking about society on a greater level. It's just so brilliantly written by Lucy Gray. I love how this chapter ends because it's putting a new dilemma for Snow, because he thinks that the hangman's noose is hovering over him and that's why he wants to run away with Lucy. But then right when he's about to leave, he's called to the commander's office and is told, congratulations, you are going to leave for officer school, meaning that his life to continuously climb within the capital system is not ended yet. Once again, we're getting a glimpse at Snow's view of humanity. He views it at his worst because when him and Lucy are running away, he says, you know what I won't miss? The people. They're mostly awful if you think about it, except for, it's like small handful. But then Lucy says, people aren't so bad really. It's what the world does to them. Like us in the arena. We did things in there we never had considered. They just left us alone. Basically saying the capital needs to get out of our business. The government needs to get out of our business. Love was never a big enough motivator for Snow. And he recognizes that and said it a couple chapters ago. But it was not enough for him to protect Shanus. It's not enough for him to run her off in the wilderness with Lucy. Even though I definitely don't think he loved either of them. And especially not Lucy. That's more of an obsession. But like within the first couple hours, he sees what his life would look like with Lucy out in the wilderness, and he doesn't like it. He one, doesn't trust the wilderness, two, desires luxury, but also recognizes that Lucy would have the upper hand on him, that he doesn't know how to survive in the wilderness, and so he would have no control. And we know how Snow feels about control. By discovering the guns that he used to kill Mayfair is in this lean-to next to the lake, not in a capital lab where his DNA is being tested, he no longer has to be worried about the potential of him being caught for this murder. All the other people involved with that are dead except for Lucy. She is the last loose end involving that murder that could potentially ruin his life. He doesn't need to run away anymore. He can go back and continue to climb up the ladder of power. And so that's why he chases after and attempts to kill her. I love that Lucy beats him to the conclusion. She is smart enough to realize that he's talking about Shanus. So if he is willing to kill Shanus, what's going to stop him from killing me? And so she gets a head start on running away from him. And I think that also seals the deal for her in his eyes, unfortunately. Also, it's interesting that every single one of Snow's murders, because they are murders, are not self-defense, truly, happen as a snap reaction. But there's enough forethought, there's enough wherewithal to know what he is doing and to be aware that this is wrong. When he beats Bobbin, when he shoots Mayfair, when he pretty much puts the noose around Shanus's neck and now is chasing after Lucy with a shotgun. Oh my god, I love this. So he calls out Lucy's name and a mockingjay picks up the melody of his, sound, and he says, give it up, you're no Jabberjay. But if you look at it at another level, he's talking to Lucy, basically saying, give it up, you're no capital citizen. You're not like me. We are not alike. You are unnatural like the mockingjays. Also lied to himself by saying, if only she had just said, I'll go alone, like I was planning all along. You would never let her do that. You aren't going to let Shanus do that, because the minute that they're out of your, orbit, you can no longer control them, and you don't trust humanity to make their own decisions. So unfortunately, I think either way he was gonna kill Lucy, but unfortunately with the snake, it now gives him the justification that he feels he needs to follow through. When Snow says if he had felt better, he would have laughed at the irony of how quickly the relationship had deteriorated into their own private Hunger Games, which I think is very interesting because in Hunger Games, there are, in the later books, alliances form, but eventually they break apart because only one can survive. By the way, Lucy singing The Hanging Tree and then the Mockingjays and Jabberjays picking it up is turning it into Snow's Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. That's his heart under the floorboard, beating loudly, just circling him. He can't hear anything else, and he's slowly going insane until he does something drastic. When Snow says, nature gone mad, genes gone bad, chaos, the reason why he hates all this, he hates nature, is because he cannot control it. And when nature is a theme in stories, it is to point out that humanity cannot control it. We cannot play God. we're watching Snow completely get rid of and cut off his old self, his old way of life, and ready to move on to being a new ruthless version of himself. And we're seeing it with like him throwing out his mother's compact and the old photos of like his family photos that he had clung to for so long after they got destroyed when he went swimming in the lake to drown the guns. He is so determined to continue on this path for power that he is willing to cut off his old self. Also, it's getting really old and tiring of him lying and being delusional, because he takes Seamus' stuff and goes, that would be appropriate as Seamus' best friend to mail it to his family as condolences. You're not his best friend, you sentenced him to death. When Dr. Gall greets Snow by saying, so the victor returns, it basically is showing that she views that even the mentors retributes in this game too. And by sending Seamus, Snow, and Lucy to District 12, it was like sending them into a new arena, and he is the last one standing. He is the victor of her Hunger Games. And Snow comes to his final conclusion of his view on humanity, which is that when Dr. Gall asks, his opinion of the Hunger Games and all that, he says that basically we are creatures who need the capital to survive, which also kind of is like hinting at colonialism, that others are incapable of existing and having a true society unless they're mirroring the one that the capital or first world countries deemed as being the right one. Damn, that was deep. When Dean Highbottom and Snow are talking about the Hunger Games and why they use kids, Snow says, because we credit them with innocence, and if even the most innocent among us turn to killers in the Hunger Games, what does that say? That our essential nature is violent. And Dean Highbottom says self-destructive. But the thing that Snow is ignoring is that this wouldn't happen. They wouldn't turn into those monsters and kill one another if it wasn't because of the capital forcing them to. If they were left on their own, they wouldn't be killing one another. So the fate of Lucy Gray is left very ambiguous, just like the song Lucy Gray, that you don't know quite what happened to her. Some people, are talking about that she disappeared and they think it's because of the mayor threatening to kill her, and Snow wonders if he killed her, or she died off in the wilderness. However, she could still very much be alive and is smart enough to know that if she reappeared in District 12, she's putting her life at stake again, not only with the mayor, but also with Snow. Or if she appeared in any of the other districts, Snow most likely could find out and come after her again. And the book ends with basically the start of Snow's reign, of him murdering friend and foe by him subtly collecting rat poison, putting it in the morphling bottle, and then dumping the morphling bottles in Dean Highbottom's trash can that used to belong to Shayna's, knowing full well that Dean Highbottom will fish them out and use them. I'm kind of sad it's over. I really enjoyed this. This was definitely a different tone from the original trilogies. They're both heavy, but this felt heavier. And the book opens with quotes from philosophers about humanity. And this was a beautifully crafted case study of showing those arguments in almost a real life scenario. And I think this was so beautifully done. I want more.